I walked into my husband's office on Valentine's Day, with roses in one hand and 2 first-class tickets to Paris in the other. I thought I was going to save my marriage. Instead, I watched him get down on one knee in front of 200 employees and propose to another woman. Not just any woman. His CEO, the same woman he had told me was only a business decision. The room exploded with applause. Cameras lifted. People cheered. Someone cried. And my husband, Jake Carter, smiled like the happiest man alive while he slid a diamond ring onto her finger. Then he kissed her. Not a quick, confused kiss. Not a mistake. Not a moment that got out of control. He kissed her like I had already disappeared from his life. And when his eyes finally found mine across that bright glass atrium, his smile died. That was the moment I understood 2 things. First, my husband had betrayed me. Second, he had forgotten who owned the company he was standing in. I did not scream. I did not throw the roses. I did not give him the public scene he deserved. I simply turned around, walked out of the building, canceled the Paris trip, froze our joint accounts, and called my lawyer. 30 minutes later, Jake had called me 152 times. By sunset, he was standing outside our front door, begging me to open it. But by then, the damage was already moving faster than his excuses. My name is Emma Carter. For 14 years, I was married to a man the world called a genius. Newspapers called him a visionary founder. Investors called him the future of healthcare technology. Employees stood taller when he entered a room. But long before the magazine covers, the keynote speeches, and the custom suits, Harlow Reed Technologies had been built at a cheap folding table in a rented office above a dental clinic in Stamford, Connecticut. Jake had the charm. I had the system. He could sell the dream. I could build the product. And my father, who trusted me more than he ever trusted Jake, put in the first real money. After my father died, those shares moved into a family holding company. Over the years, through funding rounds, buybacks, and careful legal agreements, that holding company came to control 80% of Harlow Reed. 83%. Jake knew it. The board knew it. The banks knew it. But the world did not. The world saw Jake. And for a long time, I allowed that. I told myself marriage was not a competition. I told myself it did not matter whose name appeared in articles, as long as the company survived. Jake said investors liked one clear public voice. He said my privacy made me powerful. He said I did not need to stand in front of cameras to matter. I believed him because, in the beginning, he believed in me too. That is the painful thing about betrayal. It does not always start with cruelty. Sometimes it starts with late nights, cold takeout, shared dreams, and 2 people laughing on the floor because the Wi-Fi died again. Sometimes the person who destroys your life began as the person who helped you build it. That Valentine's morning, I still thought my marriage could be saved. Jake had been distant for months. He blamed the acquisition. He blamed investor pressure. He blamed the endless meetings with Amanda Blake, the CEO he had hired 18 months earlier. Amanda was brilliant, polished, younger than me by almost 10 years. She had a sharp blonde bob, a calm voice, and the kind of presence that made people listen before she even finished a sentence. I had met her once at a charity dinner. Jake introduced me quickly, almost carelessly, and then guided the conversation back toward donors. I remembered thinking she seemed capable. I did not know she was being lied to as carefully as I was. That morning, I bought roses near the train station. Cream paper, red ribbon, 12 perfect stems. Then I tucked the Paris tickets into a black envelope with a handwritten card. 4 nights in a small hotel near the Seine. The same neighborhood where Jake and I had spent our honeymoon before success changed the way he stood, the way he spoke, and the way people looked at him. I imagined surprising him. I imagined his face softening. I imagined him saying, "Emma, I needed this." Instead, when I stepped into the lobby of Harlow Reed Technologies, the receptionist barely looked up. "Are you here for the celebration?" she asked. I smiled because I thought Jake had arranged some Valentine's event for the staff. Jake loved visible gestures, champagne, speeches, company-wide generosity that photographed well. "I suppose I am," I said. She pointed toward the atrium. "They're just getting started." I heard the applause before I saw the stage. The atrium was full of employees. At least 200 of them, gathered beneath the skylight around a platform decorated with white roses and gold balloons. Someone had hired a violinist. Someone else was recording with a phone. The company logo glowed behind the stage. And there was Jake, my husband, standing beside Amanda. He wore the dark suit I had helped him choose for board presentations. He smiled his public smile, the one that made people feel lucky to be near him. Then, before my mind could understand what my eyes were seeing, he dropped to one knee. The room erupted. Amanda covered her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. Jake opened a velvet box, and the diamond caught the light. It was the same cut I had once told him I loved. For one terrible second, my brain tried to protect me. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe it was a marketing stunt. Maybe it was some strange corporate theater for Valentine's Day. Then Amanda nodded. Jake slid the ring onto her finger. Then he stood, cupped her face, and kissed her. The bouquet slipped lower in my hand. A woman beside me whispered, "Can you believe it? They're perfect together." Perfect. That word finally made Jake turn. His eyes met mine across the crowd, and everything about him changed. The smile vanished. His face went pale. The applause seemed to collapse into silence, at least for me. He knew. He knew I had seen everything. And still, he did not come to me. He did not say my name. He did not step off the platform. He did not explain to the woman beside him that the stranger holding roses was his wife. Amanda followed his gaze and looked at me with polite confusion. Then she mouthed, "Do we know each other?" That hurt more than the kiss. Because in that moment, I understood that Jake had not only cheated, he had erased me. I turned around before my dignity could fall apart in front of strangers. No one stopped me. The receptionist smiled as I passed. "Have a great Valentine's Day," she said. I made it to the parking garage before my hands started shaking. I sat in my car with the dead roses on the passenger seat and the Paris envelope in my lap. Somewhere above me, people were still clapping for my husband and his new fiancée. I could have gone back inside. I could have screamed. I could have thrown the flowers at his face. I could have told everyone that their romantic hero had slept in my bed that morning after kissing me goodbye. But real rage, when it becomes sharp enough, gets quiet. I opened my phone. First, I canceled Paris. Then I called the bank and froze every joint account covered by our marital asset agreement. Then I called Martin Keller, my attorney. Martin had been my father's lawyer before he became mine. He answered on the second ring. "Emma," he said. "What happened?" "My husband just got engaged," I said. A pause. "To whom?" "His CEO." The silence on the line was so complete I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "I'm on my way to your house." "No," I said. "Start with Carter Family Holdings." "Emma, are you sure?" I stared through the windshield at the elevator doors, still waiting for Jake to come running out. He never did. "Yes," I said. "Withdraw the full discretionary capital support. Freeze the pending commitments. Notify the board. That will trigger a capital event," Martin warned. "It may freeze their credit line. It could collapse the acquisition." "I know. This is not something we can quietly undo." I pressed my thumb against the edge of the black envelope until it hurt. "Do it." By the time I drove home to Westport, Jake had started calling. One call, then 10, then 40, then 90. By the time I reached the house, my phone showed 152 missed calls. I walked inside with my coat still on, dropped the roses onto the kitchen island, and stood in the hallway while the doorbell rang. Then came Jake's voice through the heavy front door. "Emma, please, open the door." I looked down at my phone. Another call from him lit up the screen. The photo was old. Jake in a navy sweater, smiling at me from the deck of our first house. Before the gray at his temples, before the expensive watch, before ambition hardened into entitlement, I let it ring. "Emma, I know you're in there," he said. "Please, just talk to me. Talk." It was strange how small that word sounded after what I had witnessed. I walked to the door and looked through the side window. He was still wearing the same suit, but now his tie was crooked, and his hair was a mess. His black company car sat crooked in the driveway, like he had abandoned it before it fully stopped. For the first time all day, Jake looked like a man who understood that consequences could move faster than excuses. I opened the door halfway. His eyes moved over my face, then toward the kitchen where the roses lay like evidence. "Emma," he whispered. It wasn't what it looked like. For one terrible, almost funny moment, I realized he still thought the engagement was the main problem. He had no idea empire behind him was already on fire. "Then tell me," I said calmly. "What exactly did it look like?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Behind him, his phone began ringing. Not mine. His. He looked down, and whatever name appeared on the screen made his face collapse. I knew before he said anything. The board had found out. "We need to talk inside," he said. "No." His eyes flicked toward the street. Our neighbors' houses sat behind bare maple trees, porch lights glowing in the cold February evening. Westport was the kind of town where people pretended not to notice things while noticing everything. Jake hated being seen without control. "Please?" he said, lowering his voice. "I made a mistake." "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary," I said. "A mistake is missing a flight. You proposed to another woman in front of 200 employees." It got out of hand. I almost laughed. That was Jake's gift. He could make any disaster sound like weather. Something that happened. Something that rolled in unexpectedly. Not a choice. "When did it get out of hand?" I asked. "Before or after you bought the ring?" He swallowed. His phone buzzed again. This time I saw the name, Martin Keller. Jake saw that I had seen it. "What did you do?" he whispered. I leaned against the doorframe. "I protected what belongs to me." His panic sharpened into calculation. I recognized that look from conference rooms, from deals going wrong, from moments when Jake realized charm would not be enough. You can't just pull capital like that, he said. There are procedures, obligations, there are clauses. I corrected. And you signed them. He stared at me as if I had spoken a language he used to know, but had forgotten through arrogance. You're angry, he said softly. I understand that? No, Jake, I don't think you do. Amanda didn't know, he said quickly. That surprised me, though I tried not to show it. She didn't know what? About us. Not really. Not really? I told her we were separated. The cold moved through me. You told her we were separated while you slept in my bed every night. He closed his eyes. While you kissed me goodbye this morning. Emma. While we hosted your mother for Thanksgiving. While we renewed the lake house insurance last month. While I was planning a trip to Paris because I thought my husband was stressed, not engaged. He had no answer. My phone buzzed. A message from Martin appeared. Emergency board meeting scheduled for 7:30 p.m. They are requesting your presence by video. Do not discuss corporate matters with Jake. I showed Jake only the first line. His mouth parted. Emma, don't do this tonight. I didn't do it tonight, I said. You did. He ran a hand through his hair. Suddenly, he looked older, not distinguished, just cornered. If I'm removed, the company destabilizes, he said. People could lose jobs. Good people. That should have mattered to you before you turned their workplace into your engagement party. Silence. For years, Jake had relied on movement. If I asked a question he did not like, he took a call. If I spoke about loneliness, he blamed deadlines. If a conversation became uncomfortable, he walked into another room. Now he was standing on my porch with nowhere to go. Does Amanda know now? I asked. His silence answered. Then go explain it to her. I started closing the door. Are you divorcing me? He asked. The word should have felt dramatic. Instead, it felt administrative, like naming a document already drafted by years of small humiliations. Yes. His face crumpled for 1 second. Then fear took over again. And the company. I looked at him through the narrowing space. The company was never yours. Then I closed the door and locked it. At 7:30 that night, I sat at my kitchen table in a navy sweater with a glass of water beside my laptop. Martin sat beside me. One by one, board members joined the video call. Everyone looked careful, stunned, and professionally frightened. Then Jake appeared from his office. Behind him hung the framed magazine cover that called him the man who reinvented medical data. His camera turned on, and for the first time, every person in that meeting understood that the woman they had treated like a footnote was the only reason there was still a company to save. The chairman cleared his throat. We have received notice that Carter Family Holdings has suspended all discretionary capital support effective immediately. Mrs. Carter, can you confirm this notice is authentic? Yes. And that Carter Family Holdings remains the beneficial owner of 83% of Harlow Reed Technologies. Yes. The silence stretched. Some of them had known the ownership structure on paper, but paper and reality are not the same. Jake had been visible for so long that people had mistaken visibility for ownership. Jake leaned toward his camera. Emma, please don't make permanent decisions based on emotion. Martin touched my legal pad lightly, a reminder to stay calm. I made no decision today, I said. I executed rights that have existed for years. The chairman turned to Jake. Is there anything you need to disclose before we continue? Jakey hesitated. My personal situation has become complicated. One director repeated, complicated. Alinda Foster, a board member known for never wasting words, leaned forward. Did you represent yourself inside this company as unmarried? Jakey's jaw tightened. Yes. Were you, in fact, married? Less. Were members of executive leadership aware of your marriage? No, no one cared only about the affair. They cared that the public face of the company had concealed facts while conducting a romantic relationship with the CEO inside the company. They cared about governance, exposure, risk, liability. The general counsel spoke next. I recommend placing Mr. Carter on immediate administrative leave pending an independent investigation. Jake looked shocked. You can't be serious. The chairman sighed. I wish we weren't. By the next morning, the whole company knew. Someone saw Jake leave the executive floor carrying a cardboard box. Someone saw security deactivate his access card. Someone saw Amanda's office door stay closed. Rumors moved faster than press releases. I slept 3 hours that night. When I woke, Jake was not beside me. The silence in the room felt strange. Not lonely, just unfamiliar. At 9:15, Martin arrived with 2 thick folders. The banks have suspended acquisition financing, he said. I expected that. They want to know whether Carter Family Holdings intends to remain invested after restructuring. What did you tell them? The truth. The owner still believes in the company. That surprised me. Martin smiled slightly. You never wanted to destroy Harlow Reed. You wanted to stop one man from pretending he owned it. Exactly. People think revenge means burning everything down. Sometimes revenge means where he lets someone continue stealing credit for what you built. Around noon, my phone rang. Amanda Blake. I stared at her name before answering. Hello. Her voice was quiet. Nothing like the polished executive voice I knew from board calls. I know I probably have no right to call you. No, I said. You probably don't. She accepted that. I didn't know. I believe you. She exhaled sharply. He told me you had been separated for almost 2 years. He said the divorce paperwork was delayed because of business assets. He showed me an apartment lease. I went still. What apartment? Silence. Then Amanda said, downtown. He said he lived there during the week. Jake had rented an apartment not to live in, but to support a lie. Every late meeting. Every overnight strategy session. Every business trip that ended too late to drive home. There had been another address waiting, not because he needed another life, but because he needed evidence of one. I feel sick, Amanda whispered. You should. I never would have said yes if I had known. I believe you. I'm so sorry. For the first time since Valentine's Day, I heard genuine remorse from someone connected to the disaster. I believe you're sorry, I said. But sorry doesn't undo it. No, she paused. Will you ever forgive me? I looked out the kitchen window at the bare trees. I don't know you well enough to forgive you. She was quiet. That's fair. Late that afternoon, Martin called again. We found something. His tone changed the temperature of the room. What? Old authorization records. I need you to come in. At his office, he spread documents across the conference table. Expense approvals, equity transfer forms, investment authorizations, vendor contracts. At first glance they looked ordinary. Then Martin pointed to several signatures. They're yours. I frowned. No, they're excellent copies. I know. He slid my authentic signature beside them. The difference was tiny, but once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I never signed these. We know. The room seemed to tilt. Jake had not simply betrayed our marriage. Someone had been forging my signature on corporate documents for years. How many? I asked. Possibly hundreds. Every emotion inside me shifted. Until that moment, I thought this was a story about infidelity. Now it was larger. Corporate misconduct, fraud, possible criminal exposure. Martin looked at me carefully. Emma, if this is confirmed, Jake is not just going to lose his marriage. I finished the sentence. He's going to lose everything. The next 48 hours moved with cold precision. A forensic accounting firm from New York set up inside a locked conference room at Harlow Reed. They reviewed approvals, metadata wire transfers, compensation files, and expense reports. I stayed away from the office on purpose. If I walked in too soon, Jake would call it a wife's revenge. I wanted the evidence to speak before gossip did. By the third day, the pattern was clear. It was not one forged signature. It was a system. My name had been used to approve executive loans, inflated travel reimbursements, and vendor contracts tied to people Jake knew personally. Nothing was messy enough to scream fraud at first glance. That was why it had lasted. It was polished, layered, wrapped in corporate language. But lies age badly. Every document had a timestamp. Every approval had metadata. Every transfer left a trail. On Thursday evening, Martin called. We have enough. I was folding one of Jake's white dress shirts when the call came. Because habit is sometimes the last part of love to die. I looked down at the monogram on the cuff and suddenly felt foolish for touching it. Enough for the board, I asked. Enough for the board. Enough for civil action. Possibly enough for federal referral. I closed my eyes. For 1 second, I wished the truth had been smaller. Then I remembered the applause in the atrium. Send it, I said. The emergency board meeting took place the next morning. This time, Jake was not invited as chief executive. He was invited as the subject of the investigation. Amanda appeared from her office, pale but composed. She had temporarily stepped away from all decisions related to Jake. When asked whether she knew he was married, she said clearly, no. He told me he had been separated for 2 years. Then the investigators began. They showed signatures, metadata, wire approvals, lease agreements, expense records. They showed the downtown apartment Jake had classified as a strategic client hospitality suite. They showed jewelry purchases labeled as investor relations gifts. They showed private travel booked through corporate accounts. Weekends Amanda believed were business retreats because Jake surrounded every lie with enough paperwork to look legitimate. Amanda covered her mouth once. Jake sat frozen. When he finally spoke, his voice was thin. This is being taken out of context. The lead investigator, Denise Lyle, adjusted her glasses. Mr. Carter, metadata does not have context. It has timestamps. No one smiled. Jake tried again. I had authority to act on behalf of the company. You had operational authority, Denise said. You did not have authority to forge Mrs. Carter's signature. Then Jake looked at me, and for the first time, anger burned through the fear. You're enjoying this. Every face on the call turned toward me. I could have denied it quickly. Instead, I told the truth. No, Jake. I am not enjoying this. I am surviving it. That silenced him. By noon, the board voted unanimously to terminate Jake for cause, revoke his unvested equity compensation, and refer the findings to outside counsel for civil recovery. His name would be removed from active company materials while the investigation continued. There was no shouting. No broken glass. No dramatic movie scene. The revenge came in signatures, votes, locked accounts, and consequences. And somehow, that felt more complete. That afternoon, Amanda asked to meet me in person. I almost refused. Then I thought of her face when she learned about the apartment, and I realized there was one conversation Jake did not get to control. We met at a quiet coffee shop in Fairfield, far from the office. Amanda arrived first. She wore almost no makeup, and the diamond ring was gone. When I sat down, she stood. I'm sorry, she said. You already said that. I know. But I needed to say it while looking at you. I studied her face. There was no arrogance there. No victory. Just humiliation. I believed him. She said. That is not an excuse. It is just the truth. He made me feel chosen. That sentence hurt because I understood it. Jake knew how to make a woman feel like the whole room had rearranged itself around her. Amanda looked down at her hands. When I saw you in the atrium, I thought you were an investor's wife or someone from a charity board. I didn't know I was standing inside your life. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, he lied to both of us, Amanda. But he married me. His first duty was to me. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know. I could have hated her. Part of me wanted to. Hatred would have been easier than the truth the other woman is not always a monster. Sometimes she is another person standing in the wreckage, holding a different piece of the same lie. I won't protect you from consequences, I said. I'm not asking you to. But I won't punish you for what he did alone. Her eyes lifted. That was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was justice. 3 nights later, Jake came back to the house. He knocked once and waited. Through the window, I saw a man who looked nothing a husband I had brought flowers to on Valentine's Day. His coat was wrinkled. His face was unshaven. Without confidence, he seemed smaller. I opened the door but left the chain in place. He looked at the chain. I deserve that. Yes, he swallowed. I lost the company. No, I said. You lost the illusion that it was yours. His eyes filled, but I did not soften. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I had softened too many hard truths for too many years. I'm not here to ask you to stop the investigation, he said. Good. I'm not here to ask you to take me back. Good. He nodded slowly. I came to say I'm sorry. The old Emma would have opened the door. The old Emma would have mistaken regret for repair. But the woman standing there now had watched too much burn to confuse smoke with warmth. Are you sorry because you hurt me? I asked. Or because your life fell apart? And Jake looked down. For a long time he said nothing. Then, very quietly, he answered, I don't know anymore. And that was the first honest thing he had said since Valentine's Day. He stood there waiting for me to make the future less frightening. I did not. The silence between us no longer belonged to resentment. It belonged to truth. Finally he nodded. I understand. I was not sure he did. But for the first time in a very long time, his understanding was no longer my responsibility. I closed the door gently, not angrily. Gently, because I was done giving him my fire. The divorce took months. Real divorces usually do. There were financial disclosures, property evaluations, depositions, and more paperwork than either of us thought possible. Because of the prenuptial agreement and the company ownership structure, the legal side was straightforward. Emotionally, nothing was simple. Jake never contested my ownership of Harlow Reed. He could not. The documents had existed for years, and the investigation had stripped away every illusion he had built around them. The civil claims related to the forged signatures were resolved through restitution, settlements, and permanent restrictions on Jake serving as an officer under certain agreements. It was painful for him, but it was not punishment for one bad afternoon. It was the consequence of choices repeated over time. Justice, I learned, rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in numbered pages. Amanda completed her ethics review. Investigators found no evidence that she had participated in the forged documents or financial misconduct. Her greatest mistake had been believing a man she loved. 6 weeks later, the board reinstated her as CEO. Before accepting, she called me. I won't take the position if you think I shouldn't. I appreciated the question more than she knew. You earned the job, I said. But because of everything. Because of everything. I interrupted gently. Don't waste the chance to do it honestly. She was quiet. I don't expect us to become friends. I don't either. But I hope one day I never wanted your life. I looked out at the first signs of spring pushing through the frozen flower beds. I already believed that. When we ended the call, I realized forgiveness had arrived without making an announcement. Not complete forgiveness. Not the kind that erases scars, just enough to stop carrying someone else's guilt. The board asked if I wanted to become CEO. Years earlier, I might have said yes instantly. Instead, I surprised everyone. No. The chairman blinked. You built this company? Yes. You own it? Yes. Then Wyatt. I smiled. 'Cause ownership and purpose are not always the same thing. I accepted the role of executive chair instead. I focused on long-term strategy and allowed Amanda to run daily operations under stronger governance and a board that finally remembered who held the voting power. For the first time in years, the company felt honest. 3 months after Valentine's Day, I found the black envelope with the canceled Paris tickets in my desk drawer. The handwritten card was still inside. I read it once. Then I fed it through the paper shredder, not out of anger, out of acceptance. That evening, I opened my laptop and booked another trip. Same city, different hotel, one ticket. Paris greeted me with warm sunshine, narrow streets, and cafes spilling onto sidewalks. I walked without a plan. I lingered in bookstores where I understood only half the language. I sat beside the sign with coffee that went cold, because I was too busy watching the world move around me. On my second evening, I crossed a bridge as the sky turned gold. Years earlier, Jake and I had stood in that city making promises about our future. This time, I made one promise only to myself. Never confuse being needed with being valued. They are not the same thing. Nearly a year later, Harlow Reed launched a new investment initiative for early-stage healthcare technology companies, founded by women and underrepresented entrepreneurs. The idea had been sitting in one of my notebooks for almost a decade. Now we finally built it. At the launch event, Amanda introduced the program. She thanked the board. She thanked our employees. Then, unexpectedly, she thanked me. Some people build companies, she said. Others build culture. Their truth eventually matters more than appearances. We are here because Emma Carter refused to sacrifice either. The applause that followed sounded different from the applause I had heard on Valentine's Day. That applause had celebrated illusion. This one honored integrity. The difference mattered. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten letter from Jake. He wrote that he had taken a management job at a small regional software company in Vermont. No magazine interviews. No keynote speeches. No corner office. Every morning, he unlocked the office himself, made coffee for the staff, and ended the day knowing exactly what his title meant: employee. He apologized again, but this time not for losing the company, not for losing his reputation, and not for being caught. He apologized for spending years believing success gave him permission to ignore the promises he made to the people who loved him. At the bottom of the page, he wrote one final sentence. I hope one day I become someone worthy of the forgiveness I asked for. I folded the letter and placed it in a box with old photographs. Not because I wanted to return to the past, because pretending it never happened would teach me nothing. Some chapters deserve to stay closed. They do not deserve to be erased. People sometimes ask if revenge gave me peace. The honest answer is no. Revenge gave me justice. Peace came later. Peace came the day I stopped measuring my future by someone else's betrayal. Jake lost his marriage because he chose deception over honesty. He lost his career because he chose ambition over integrity. He lost the company because he forgot that borrowed power is never the same as earned trust. As for me, I did not win because he lost. I won because I finally remembered that my worth had never depended on whether someone else recognized it. Sometimes the strongest revenge is not destroying the person who hurt you. Sometimes the strongest revenge is refusing to let their choices destroy the person you were always meant to become.